Hello, everyone. My name is Rich, and you are watching Indie Plus. Now, this is one of our Indie Plus live panels that are held over a Hangout on air. I've got question and answer turned on for this panel, which is how to GM a great fight scene. So if you've got a question that you want us to ask, and you're not hearing anyone ask it, then feel free to jump in there and I'll do what I can to prioritize that above the list. Now, first of all, I want to let you know this event upholds the Indie Plus community standards. To find out more about those standards, you can go to our website at indieplus.org. Please be aware that there is a chance that this event may include explicit or abusive language. We're talking about GMing great fight scenes, so someone could get a little excited talking about how things are happening in the combat. So, be warned. Now, I've got a fantastic group of people with a wide variety of experiences in different tabletop games. So I'm super excited because normally, Indie Plus, we don't always get to talk about all these fantastic games. So I'm very appreciative of the people who have come on. And I'm going to introduce them now. First, we have, and I'm going alphabetically, Jeff Rientz, who's an OSR blogger, historian, and game writer. How are you, Jeff?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm loving having you on, man. Next we have, it's a first-time member to a guest to our panels, is Jared Gunning, who's the Savage Daddy. He's a Savage Worlds enthusiast, and I would probably call him an expert. He hosts the weekly Savage Worlds GM Hangout podcast, which is really long, but I wrote it down. How are you doing, Jared?
Fantastic.
Excellent, excellent. Thanks for making time for us. Also, brand new to the panels, I'm a fan of her podcast, her primary podcast, where she's running Star Wars Edge of the Empire, and that's called Campaign. She's the co-creator of the OneShotPodcast.com, and also working on an RPG of her own called Epiphany. It is Kat Murphy. How are you, Kat?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Rich?
Doing great, doing great. Last but not least, it only lasts because, it's KR. Sorry, Krista, is the founder of Christicon, a longtime GM of many indie RPGs, and also the co-creator of Galileo Games. Krista White, how are you, Krista?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
This is fantastic. Okay, all right. We have, as is our wont, we went ahead to all of the followers of Indie Plus and me, Rich Rogers. We asked for questions ahead of time. And so we have a number of questions here that have been submitted by followers of Indie Plus and myself. But again, if you don't hear the question, you're watching this live, feel free to jump in on the Q&A. So I'm going to head down these questions, and if it's okay, I'll kind of start off with a popcorn. So if somebody wants to answer it, feel free to jump in, and then I'm going to kind of pick on the people who aren't able to talk us or aren't answering as many, and I'll lead off with you guys, all right? So I'm going to start off with a popcorn question. This question is from Tara Zuber. Now, she asked a bunch of great questions, and I've tried to jumble them up along with the other questions that we have. And she asked, what's a trick or a technique that you've seen or experienced another GM using that you admired or immediately wanted to adapt for your own games?
As far as Savage Worlds, one of the things that the GM, the Game Master Savage Worlds, can do is he has bennies that he can soak, use to soak damage for his wildcard NPCs. This is a trick I picked up from Ron Blessing, another giant in the community. And the trick is the GM never uses his bennies to soak damage for his bad guy. He uses his bennies to make wounds hit harder, to make hits more frequently, because there's nothing more anticlimactic for a player in Savage Worlds to explode on dice, cause 4 wounds to the big bad, and then have the big bad soak it all. So that's one thing I do as a GM that I picked up off of another GM as far as Savage Worlds goes.
Well, Jared, I like that technique a lot. I think giving a magical pool of points or whatever in some systems to allow the villains to continue to operate despite the efforts of the player tends to rob the players of agency. So ditching that particular rule from Savage Worlds or not using it is, I think, a good move. Though I'm a fan of Savage Worlds in general, I'd just like to say. A technique that I've seen used to great effect in games that use tactical displays is, in lieu of using miniatures for some of or all of the bad guys, use little pieces of candy, and the player who kills the monster gets to eat the candy. And then you can, if you're a sneaky sort of game master, you can control who they're going to pick on by what kind of candy you represent them with.
That's great. I remember there's a game, I can't remember what game it is specifically off the top of my head, but they referred to their bennies as yum-yums and suggested using candy. So I think that wouldn't be so good with Savage Worlds if your bennies were things that were consumable, right? Right, Jared?
I've run a Scooby-Doo adventure and have used actual Walmart boxed Scooby snacks as pennies.
Well, Kat, Krista, have either of you seen some things that you've stolen from other GMs?
I have.
Oh, go ahead,
You
Kat.
first, Krista.
All right, I'll go first. So, actually, this technique I just saw recently wasn't actually something that a GM did, but another player did. We were playing a Fate game, and I can't remember how the mechanic was working, but one of the players had a spotlight. I think he had an aspect that he was using for the scene, and there was a player who had been pretty quiet during the entire combat, and what he did was, rather than utilize that himself, he turned it over to this player who hadn't had a lot of spotlight time and seemed to be having some difficulty inserting himself into the game, and I think the player was very happy to be given that sort of space to have some spotlight time, and I thought that was a really great thing to do. This other player had already had nice spotlight time, so it was great for everybody to sort of shine that light on this player who was new to the system and was having a little bit of trouble getting going.
Cool. And then I guess this I picked up from my friend Kevin O'Brien with Crunchier Systems. We're a group that no matter what really thrives on the roleplay aspect of things. So he kind of has everyone roll their attack at the top of the initiative turn, so you know what's happening and you can plan it out and make it really cinematic as a group. So it's kind of just like a flurry of attacks, so you know if you fail coming up and you have a chance to lean into that failure.
Nice, Kat. I like that. Hey, I want to stick with you because there was a follow-up from Tara that I'm curious what the answers would be. You know, each system has its own flavor of fighting. Which system's combat mechanics are most satisfying to you as a player and as a GM?
Sure. I'm one of those. I love every system. I like really crunchy systems, and I like the loosest story games. But in terms of combat, it really comes down to either I want Shadowrun and like D&D 3.5 because I know them super well and I know, but it's what I grew up on, and I can go crazy on it. Or a system that I really, really, really love is Feng Shui. I think that the way it cinematically breaks down a turn is fantastic and leads to a lot of fun.
I'm going to work backwards through the answer order from the first question. So, Krista, what combat mechanics really make you happy?
I really like Cortex Plus and Fate because I like the ability of the players to be able to take control of the situation and also to have their successes build on each other throughout the combat system. I am one of those players who doesn't enjoy crunchy games as much, so the softer mechanics in those games and the heavy reliance on player narrative is really appealing to me.
Cool. Jeff, what about you? I know there are like 50 bazillion versions of OSR games, so you got to choose one now. It's going to make everybody else but maybe 5 people happy. Or angry. No, angry. 5 people will be happy. Everyone else will hate you. Go for it.
I prefer the 1981 Dungeons and Dragons basic expert rules. It's about as trimmed down as you can get and still have Dungeons and Dragons in a way that's recognizable to most people. And that allows a lot of sort of narrative trickery to enter into play. You don't have to fiddle with a lot of rules that you see starting as early as first edition advanced D&D, so that you can easily bolt on things. I'm a big fan of when things go horribly awry, so I like to have a fumble system in place for fight scenes and things like that. And it's just easy to tack those things onto what is a very simple, loosey-goosey system that's just waiting to be exploited by a tinkerer. And the 81 edition of Basic Expert is that for me.
I'm going to ask a slightly dumb question. Is that Blue Box?
No, that would be a sort of a pink box with the Errol Otis cover, and inside was an orange rule book.
Okay.
If that helps at all.
It
Tom
helps.
Moldvay edited it.
All right, awesome. And then, Jared, are we go with Savage Worlds?
Well, it's the reason I play the system. Is the combat mechanic. I like the idea that wounds are not, or damage is not arbitrary hit points. It actually uses a wound and fatigue system that drives you to incapacitation, and each level of damage you take for wounds versus your toughness imposes a -1 penalty to everything. So it conveys the idea that, yes, you've just taken a hit, you're not down, but you're not performing at your ultimate. The other thing I like about Savage Worlds too is the initiative system being card-based. It doesn't rely on everybody making agility rolls. It's 100% random from a draw of the card. And the bending mechanic that applies to the rest of the game also helps with combat mechanics as well, because when I do take 4 wounds at once worth of damage that would knock my character out, I can always drop a bending, make 1 roll, and have it never happen dramatically and narratively. So the reason I'm a fan of Savage Worlds and the combat system in particular is it's a nice mixture and merging of crunch, but also cinematic and narrative elements that really come together nicely in that game.
Cool. Thanks, Jared.
Mm-hmm.
Krista, I'm going to jump back over to you. Chris Groff asked, and I know you kind of half answered this, or you gave one answer already, so I'm excited to hear what other tools you have. How do you keep the action engaging between various player roles when some of them may not be primarily combatants?
Yeah, so when you have non-combatants, I think one of the things that you can do is make sure that there are things that the combatants need that those other characters can use their specialties to facilitate. So while someone with a sword is doing something, maybe he loses a sword, or he needs a special sword to kill the dragon or whatever, and so your thief, who's not going to be a combat-oriented character, can be there nearby doing his thing in order to get the fighter what he needs to be able to have a successful combat. So that would be one thing that I would think that the non-combat characters could do. And of course, as a GM, you kind of have to plan that out. And that can be rough. That means that there are a lot of moving parts for you to keep track of during a combat. But, as a GM, you learn to juggle eventually.
True, eventually. Jeff, I'm going to jump over to you. Another way to think of this is like what happens when the wizard's out of spells. But how would you answer that question of keeping the different roles engaged in a fight?
Well, what happens when a wizard is out of spells? I guess to me that's when the real fun begins. When the players start exhausting their game mechanical resources, it forces them to rely on their own natural guile and cunning in ways that I find extremely entertaining. So my goal as a dungeon master often is to see if I can deplete all of those resources while still leaving the players trapped in 5 levels down in some hellhole and see if they can claw their way out of it. So, you know, it may have seemed like a pushover to fight 5 goblins on the way in, but fighting those same 5 goblins on the way out when you got no spells, no arrows, and half your team is unconscious, suddenly you've got a whole different ballgame.
Nice, nice. Jared, what about you? What tips do you have for people that may not necessarily be super combatants and keeping them engaged?
Well, one of the things I like to do when I do combats is to have also a non-combatant element going, a ticking clock, a door that needs to be opened, something of that nature. What I find that I end up doing is I like to give the non-combatant characters a non-combatant foil in the actual gameplay. If we were doing, and I'll just talk about general genres because Savage Worlds is a genre-neutral system. You could have, if you're running a cyberpunk game, it could be the hacker trying to get into a system or open a door while each stage of the combat is going on. It could also be hacker versus hacker. It could be a weird scientist or mad scientist trying to sabotage or get a bridge to extend. I like the idea that non-combatants, and in Savage Worlds too, non-combatants can still participate in combat by doing tricks and gang up and all these other things that are involved in Savage Worlds. For example, one of the things that you can do in Savage Worlds is you can do a smarts or an agility trick against an opponent, which you do not have to be in melee combat range for that to happen. And one of the things that one of my characters does frequently, she plays a character that is very, we'll say, buxom, very high on the charisma thing, not a heavy combatant. She will get at the outskirts of a melee combat and literally flash everybody. And that serves as an agility trick that gives the other characters a bonus to attack. So I'll just say that there's always things that characters can do in any game, or players can do in any game, that they aren't necessarily combatants to get involved. But I'm a fan of the providing another non-combatant foil for the non-combat characters.
Thanks, Jared. Kat, what about you? What do you have to offer?
Well, so I'm really interested in running combats where each side has their own goal, and where there are multiple possible win conditions, right? Where the end result isn't all people dying on either side of the equation. So I find if you have those strong goals going in, it's really easy for the non-combatant's role to be accomplishing the goal, like grabbing something and getting out of there while everyone else is distracted, foiling the other party's goal, or finding ways to aid the player using the environment. Say, if you're doing something with levels, that's difficult for a player because, say, the opposing party has the height advantage, and it's going to be a while before the players can get up to that level. The non-combatant can minimize that distance and effectively cut out a round or two of movement. Things like that that have a mechanic impact on the game, or from in the sense of grabbing something and getting out of there, from a dramatic standpoint, really change the way the fight works. I think that really just comes down into building multifaceted enough fights so that they aren't so much about fighting as about conflict resolution, because all a combat is a conflict that needs some sort of resolution.
Cool, cool. So this next question comes from Jen Martin. I'll kick off with you, Jeff, if you don't mind. How do you avoid the grind and repetition of combat?
This is a common complaint for Dungeons and Dragons, that you have to murder 7,000 orcs to get to 10th level or something like that. And I find the issue really comes down to it and I apologize, my camera seems to be futzing up on me at the moment. It only takes a few minutes of work to turn any particular band of orcs or skeletons or seemingly faceless minions into an encounter that the player characters will remember, even if it's just little visual cues like one orc is wearing a bat-winged helmet like you'd see somebody on a heavy metal cover wear or something like that. They're going to remember and cue in on that, and suddenly the combat in many players' mind will all be about that guy with the helmet. Or if you know have one of the goblins kick a puppy right before the fight starts, and suddenly the emotional stakes are huge compared to a normal goblin fight. You know, it just takes one little tag like that to turn yet another combat into the most memorable combat of the night.
Yeah, I gotta say a puppy kicker's going down. Cats?
Yeah.
I don't know. Puppy kicker going down. Jared, what about you? What do you do to avoid the grind and repetition?
I'm a big fan of the Indiana Jones method. What I call, if a combat in a bar is good, a combat in a bar on fire is even better. If you can cause a situation where the environment becomes another component and another combatant, it adds a bit of exhilaration and thrill to break up the monotony of I swing, I hit, you take damage, I swing, I hit, you take damage.
Nice, nice. Krista, what about you? How do you avoid that grind and repetition?
I think the most important thing that I would advise is that all of the player characters have an emotional investment in what's going on, right? So the storyline, and this sort of dovetails with some of the other questions that are coming up on our list, but the storyline needs to culminate in a conflict of some kind, and I really appreciate Kat's emphasis on the fact that a combat doesn't have to be all fighting, it's about conflict resolution, right? So that feeds right into my feeling that if everybody's emotionally invested, their characters have goals and are emotionally invested in what's happening, it's going to be very easy to avoid the repetition. You may be performing the same acts, but the emotional atmosphere is going to be very different, and so it's going to at least make it feel different every time.
Cool. Kat, what's your input on this one?
So, I think what makes things feel grindy is when you do the exact same way, the exact same thing, the exact same way, over and over and over. As a GM, the thing that I'm always trying to get players to in a combat is to give up on Plan A. Plan A being go in, do the things we're best at the way we're good at them, and just straight shoot all of the people in a row. And Plan B, which is figure something out quickly, use the environment, actually engage, because definitely Plan A is going to get us all killed. And if you can get them into that Plan B every single time, I don't think it matters that you have combat after combat after combat using the same mechanics, because you're going to have to approach each one as an individual problem. So that's how I like to think of it, making each thing push the players into a place where they're actively engaging with the combat instead of relying on a set plan.
Thanks, Kat. Now, I just got a question from the audience that I noticed here from Jim McClure. I'm going to put this up and see, does anyone have an answer different because of the slight variation on this question from what we've just talked about? How do you keep the combat interesting in long campaigns where the players are running their characters' same mechanics over and over each week? So it is a similar question to what we just answered, but that long campaign, that does give an interesting twist. I'll just kind of leave it out there. Do we have any answers for that? Especially, I think the games that kind of last longer, like Savage Worlds and OSR games, are really campaign length.
Yeah, I mean, I prefer campaign length games. So, do you need a combat every week? That's my question, right? I mean, you certainly need to have something happening, and there's going to be conflict resolution, but does everybody have to pull their guns out? That would be my question. If there's you have to tease out the long storyline, right? And sometimes that long storyline is simply going to be a whole session where people are sitting around and strategizing, or there are emotional scenes that are occurring that don't have anything to do with swords and knives and beating up bad guys, right? Inter-party conflict can sort of serve this purpose as well. And I don't personally like PvP, but I also think if there's no tension in a party, then you aren't going to have as much flavor in the end. So people shouldn't be at each other's throats, at least if that's something you enjoy, great. That's not something I particularly enjoy, but there should be a little friction between characters, just like there is in real life with real friends and real colleagues at work.
Nice, nice. Any other answers on the long campaigns and keeping things fresh mechanically?
Yeah.
I've got. Oh,
Go ahead. You go first.
okay. I was going to say, if anyone's coming here from the campaign podcast, I love campaigns. We're 20-plus episodes in, and we've had maybe 3 combats, maybe. So I definitely don't think you need to have a combat every week. It really depends on the system and the players. We're super story-driven, but in things where players do have a lot of combat ability, and that's clearly a focus of the system, I think that there are a lot of things that you can do to keep it fresh for them. First, I find that whenever I see a player like in a rut of using the same ability, I'll just take that away from them for the combat. I'll craft something to make it so that, no, these people can't be tripped. You can't just trip people all of the time, and give them something to think around how to play their character. And then also, there are a lot of systems around these days, like Dungeon World, where people have a very limited number of actions, and the emphasis is on describing the way you use that cinematically to add something to the combat. And I think you can bring that into any game. So if the focus is on description of the action versus just saying what the ability that you're using is and saying the stats and the damage output, each combat can turn into something potentially really cool.
Nice. Jared, you had an answer?
Yeah, well, if we're talking about combat, I think the thing that keeps, for me, the word interesting and the unexpected go together like peanut butter and chocolate. If you're going to make something interesting, it should be something that's unexpected. One of my favorite movie fight scenes of all time takes place in The Untouchables. In the first shootout in Grand Central Station, where right in the middle of it, here comes a baby carriage. Right into the middle of the crossfire. As far as the long-running campaign, I would say have the characters that they've defeated before reappear. The NPCs they've defeated before, have them reappear and be there seeking vengeance. Maybe have the villain actually have another group of I don't want to say combatants, antagonists. They've upset somebody else in this game world other than just the players. So now the players have an interesting option of, well, is the enemy of my enemy my friend kind of situation, to introduce something that's unexpected. With Savage Worlds in particular and combat, I find that players do get in a rut as far as, well, I'm going to make my fighting roll, I'm going to do this. One of the things that I do to try to keep it fresh is demonstrate the other maneuvers that are possible in a combat by having the NPCs use them. For example, throwing dirt in somebody's eyes in Savage Worlds has a mechanical rule that governs it. In Savage Worlds, you could take as many combat actions as you would like in a round. So what I like to do sometimes is have something as simple as an NPC push a character down, and now just try to keep them down the whole time, just to or have it demonstrated on another NPC, not necessarily against the player, but things that force them to use their skills in new and interesting ways, or things that are completely unexpected showing up in the middle of what they expect to happen, I think is the way to keep combats and your campaign interesting.
Cool, cool. We actually have another live question I'm going to jump to real quick because it's a question that we have coming forward in the document. So, John B asks, do you feel that you need to have flavor for every action in combat to keep people interested, or does it slow things down and you focus on big moments? So let's lead off, Jeff. You think you can lead
I
off
don't feel it's required to have some sort of momentary improvisation of what is happening in the combat in the kind of games that I run, where I truly believe that every fight should have some sort of meaningful stakes to the players. In Dungeons and Dragons, at least the versions I run, those stakes are very simple. You can be murdered in any given round in Dungeons and Dragons, so you need to do something about that fact. And because the stakes are already set that high, there are some rounds where I think it's okay for the players to say, I just punched the orc in the face, and not worry about the color too much. Now, if you're playing a kind of game where there's a certain assumption that the players are going to get through some of these fight scenes intact because of the story you're trying to build together, and I have nothing against those sorts of games, then I think it's incumbent on all participants to realize if it's not about who lives and who dies at the end of this combat, it has to be about something else. And for me, it's about entertaining the other people at the table.
Cool. Thanks, Jeff. Kat, what about you? How would you mix up? Do you need to do every single bit?
No, I don't think you need to. It depends. I also feel like, honestly, you don't always need to roll. You can just straight up describe some things that are happening, because the rolling can cut down the drama happening elsewhere in the scene. I like focusing on the big moments and encouraging all the other players to support those. But yeah, just whatever works for you guys. That's when I think that typically if the group works together long enough, they know what things they do and do not put importance on, and anything that's important should have cool emphasis and dramatic explanation.
Oh, Kat, you can't tell people to do what works for them. We're experts here. You guys come on, right? Why are they watching this if they already know what to do? I'm joking. Krista, what about you? I'm assuming that we don't have to describe every minute of every battle or every round, right? But what's your guide?
Yeah. I don't think that's necessary. I mean, obviously, if somebody makes an incredible dice roll, you really need to acknowledge that moment, right? Even if it isn't something that turns the tide of a combat scene. You need to give that player some spotlight time. But again, there are so many moving parts, emotional stakes. Maybe there's an emotional moment coming up that you want to freeze frame on and take care of, even if the dice rolls aren't that hot. We're the experts, but our expert advice is do what works for you, but also do what works for you at the moment, under the circumstances that are happening at the table, right? So you need to pay attention to the moment, I think, as well.
Jared, I'm going to come at you with some savage rolls from my personal experience when, and Arnold Cassell knows this, a skeleton, a crappy skeleton, exploded 4 times damage on him and killed one of his characters. He's still mad about it. That was years ago. So, that can be built in with savage rolls, right? You do every single roll, right?
No, not necessarily. I think it's important when to do that dramatic. I'm a fan of describe what you're doing, but because Savage Worlds has exploding dice and crazy things can happen, I'm a fan of let's delay what the outcome of that is until after you roll. And if it's like, I unsheathed my trusty sword, I intimidate him by making some Conan maneuvers, and then I come down on him. Pause right there. Make your roll. Let's see what happened. Oh, look, you exploded 5 times. I know that amount of damage when he rolls it is probably going to be enough wounds to kill that extra. So at that point, when characters do incredibly well, in that situation, I go, you murder him. It's not even close. Why don't you describe what happened? I'm a fan of, in extraordinary circumstances where the players perform well beyond the expectations of the moment or the dice, give them narrative control to describe what that damage is. But yeah, even in Savage Worlds, there's only so many ways you can say I pulled the trigger on my weapon. You don't need to have a narrative description for each one of those. But I think that one of the things that happens in Savage Worlds a lot is, like you said, there's exploding damage. You can have a character that does D4 damage deliver 30 points of damage to a character when they're not expecting it, and that may be enough to kill a novice if they don't do the wounds right. So I think that with Savage Worlds in particular, because it's so cinematic, and so many different things can happen, that it becomes an issue of narratively describe what you're doing, pause, make the dice roll. Now, based on that dice roll, let's let the dice roll inform the role play, and you describe for me narratively what happened. And I think that breaks the monotony a lot in Savage Worlds. But do I have characters? I agree with what Kat said. If I've got a character in Savage Worlds that has a D12 fighting, going up against a goblin who's an extra who can take one wound, I don't need to roll dice for that. The characters walk up, I go through it, I skewer him top to bottom. Yes, of course you do. That's exactly what happens. Moving on. I don't need to break out dice and roll for that.
Fair. Jeff, we lost a video on you. Are you still with us?
I'm still here. I just think my camera went from crappy to not working at all, and I apologize for that.
All right. Well, the ghost of Jeff, do you have an answer for us on every action, especially in an OSR game? I'm really curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I like rolling lots of dice all the time, and things could go horribly awry every time you pick up the dice to throw them. I see what happens at the game table, a large amount of sort of emergent properties that come from character behavior plus random dice rolls, and that's where the story comes from in or OSR games. So while I totally get what Jared is saying about you can just walk up and kill that goblin, I want there to be a small chance that the goblin actually kills the superhero who walks up to him with the Conan sword. That once in a million possibility exists, not to actually happen every single time, but to remind everybody at the table that swinging swords around really is a dangerous profession, and you shouldn't take the usage of violence quite as lightly as maybe you do when you're deep down in the dungeon, that every time you pull that sword there is a risk involved.
Jeff, I'm a little confused. Like, if that same goblin is facing a 7th or 8th level fighter, is there really any? There's no risk, right? I mean, how's that goblin going to take him down?
Yeah, I don't think under most editions of Dungeons and Dragons played without house rules of any sort, there is any chance for that to happen. This is why I never play without a fumble chart and a critical chart handy, and so maybe you can survive the fight on paper using just the exact rule book that I quoted earlier, but I always cheat in those regards, so I always have a chance that maybe the goblin's going to chop your foot off and you'll hop around on one foot for the rest of your fighting career as a result thereof.
Oh, that's an awesome answer. Hey, Krista, did you have a follow-up on this one?
I did. I'd like to expand a little bit on Jared's idea of the narrative control for players. I mean, as someone who plays indie games almost exclusively, as a GM, I am a complete fan of, even when there's nothing critical happening, letting the player describe what their success or failure looks like within the confines of the rules and what they rolled, just because it makes my life easier as a GM. You expend a lot of energy as a GM at the table, and so if you can delegate some of that energy to your players to describe what's happening, more power to you. That's one of the tricks I learned about GMing indie games that I'm really grateful for, because it means I have much more energy at the table to, do other things or play a longer game.
It also furthers character engagement or player engagement as well, right?
Yeah, I agree with
Absolutely.
what Krista and Jared have both said on this point. However, I will say that if once in a while, as the game master, you pick up that narrative duty and tell back to the player how excruciatingly awesome their character really is, that can really feel good from the player end once in a while too.
Agreed.
Yeah, yeah. Or
Absolutely.
comboing the two where you let the player do a thing and then you kind of just add in a little bit of like the chorus, the Greek chorus, and the play kind of screams to the high heavens. The bard sings a song about the amazing thing, that kind of.
Yeah, it's also something you can even turn over to a player sitting next to them. Like this, you're standing next to them in the battle. Describe what you just saw happen.
Nice.
Is something else you can do as well.
Nice.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
I'm stealing that. My Primetime Adventures game tomorrow is going to be a combat. I'm just warning you guys. They're all in Europe, so they're asleep right now, so they won't even see this. I'll just hit them in their hospital drama with some combat, just so no. Okay, Tara Zuber asked a question that I think Krista and Kat both will want to tear into. So, Kat, I'm gonna lead off with you. So, how do you ensure the fight scene serves the story?
Oh man. Okay. So touching on what I said earlier, that whoever your combatants are, whatever your monster is, that it needs to have goals, right? And in a long-running campaign, I find that those goals should probably tie into the larger story. I'm not a huge fan of the random encounter, the truly random encounter. I like things to serve larger plots. That can get intimidating though, because when you're staring at the entirety of a campaign. So I like to think of things kind of in terms of arcs, right? I know what I'm accomplishing during an arc, and when I go into designing an arc from the outset, I keep kind of like a list going of themes that I think serve it. And things that might be fun to encounter during that time. So I don't need to have all of my ideas completely fleshed out from the forefront, but whenever I go, it's around time for them to have a combat, I think through, okay, who's around? Is it appropriate for that to happen? Does this serve the themes and the feel of this arc? How will this affect either character growth, push the storyline I'm trying to go through, or one of the storylines that the players came to me with? So that's kind of what I'm dealing with. Crystal, you want to hit it, and if I have anything to add, I'll come back on.
I couldn't have said it any better, honestly. I had the exact same thought about the process. I'll go maybe a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty of how I might do that, which is to think like a villain. So, players can get very creative with how they're going to handle particular situations, especially if they know who the big bad is, and what their MO is. So you have to sort of turn the tables on the players and do the same thing to them. You need to think like you're big bad and say, well, I know I'm encountering these heroes, and this guy has this specialty, and this guy has this specialty, and this guy has this specialty. And then you really want to put the pain on them. What's going to hurt them the most? What's going to give them the worst possible choice to make? Are you going to save the tramway full of kids, or are you going to save your girlfriend? Which one is it going to be, Pete? So you have to, you need to plan out, and I'm lucky I have a big commute, so I can think about these things as I'm driving a long way to work every day. And so that's how I would go about inserting the story arc in the manner that Kat suggested.
Nice, nice. I think I'll jump over to Jeff. I'm curious, Jeff, what would you suggest? How do you make sure the combat serves the story?
Oh, well, doing dungeon crawling style old school D&D, I actually invert that relationship. The storyline serves the fight scenes. So when crafting a dungeon's environment to be explored, one of the first questions I ask myself is, why would this underground space be inhabited by so many hostile monsters? This allows you to then build sort of a narrative logic to the dungeon that propels the unending hordes of creatures that the players are going to fight as part of exploring the dungeon. So that maybe is a cheat in answer of your question, but I actually have the storyline serving the combats rather than vice versa.
Nice. So what about you, Jared? What do you have?
I don't know that every combat can serve the story per se. I think that every combat should have consequences and a goal. If I wanted to try to make sure that the majority of the combats, and I agree with Krista with the pulp era monologuing James Bond style villain big bad. I do like the impossible Sophie's Choice for the player character of, hey, either you defeat me or 3 missiles are going in 4 different directions and it's going to blow up the entire continent. Oh, the impossible choice. I like that. Along those lines, too, I like to introduce a MacGuffin into a combat. That the reason that the big bad is there at all is in pursuit of this thing he needs for his bigger overall arching plan. And the combat may be nothing more than a mere distraction to him actually getting that. I think that's one way you can kind of make the combats in a long-running campaign or a story serve the overarching story, in that they're a byproduct of whatever the goals and machinations of the big bad and the villains and antagonists involved happen to be. But there is something to be said for the barroom brawl that is not at all involved in any way with the major overarching plot. Because if you try to go too far to one side, then your characters or your players might metagame and always be looking for the, wait, what are we really doing here? And trying to focus on that instead of necessarily the combat.
Cool. Kat, did you have a follow-up on this?
I did. Jared's point, I think, is a really good one. When I say I don't like random counters, I don't mean that I don't like things that have nothing to do with my overarching main plot. I think that those are super fun. They really add something to the campaign. Everyone loves a good barroom brawl. How I tie it back in is I make sure that the themes of that barroom brawl help change something going on with a character, that either like push where someone is in a mental space, that's just like reminds them of a responsibility they have somewhere else. I like making it personal in a way that continues character development even when we're not handling the main thing. In systems where you kind of focus on one person at a time, I find that it's pretty easy to do, to just, you know, curb something, to have to do more with what the characters were looking to do with their one guy. I mean, I know that not all games involve people who like to play with character development. It's just something I really like to do. So that's what I'd say. Don't shy away from things that don't have to do with your main plot. There are lots of plots to explore out there. I just think tying them into a cohesive thing and putting purpose behind each combat makes the world stronger.
Nice. I'm going to stick with you, Kat, on this. We had a question from the audience that is very similar to a question that both Brendan Conway and Tara Zuber had asked. Jim McClure asked on the Q&A, speaking of big bads, what do you do to make boss battles and finales more epic or memorable? I know Krista kind of touched on that one with the Peter Parker example, but are there any other things you do for making sure that there's a payoff or epicness to that big boss or level boss type of end?
This could be the entire hour, really, though, us just talking about how to handle the big boss encounter. I'd say that my biggest thing with it, though, is your big boss on your campaign is probably going to be one person. And no matter what system you're working in, and no matter how many actions that person has, one person in a room with everyone around them fighting them gets really boring really fast, and they're going to kill that person before you want them to. And there are lots of ways to handle that. Something that I like to do is use the environment to scale the combat into, like, part 1, you have to get past this environmental issue while the person is free to shoot at you. Part 2, you've cleared that stage, they've added minions, you're dealing with that while you're trying to get to them. Part 3, you guys, almost entirely depleted of your resources, are finally at the person. I think thinking about it in terms of those stages to fully showcase everything that was ever important about your villain from a mechanic standpoint will go further towards making that end feel really epic. There's a lot more that's emotional there, but again, I don't want to just stay on this forever. So my biggest piece of advice is tier the encounter and make certain that at no point can your players just surround and beat your big bad.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on a big boss fight at the end of a dungeon? What do you do?
Yeah, first of all, I really want a big boss fight to involve somebody the players have already encountered. Preferably somebody they've encountered and have wrecked them up pretty bad. So it becomes about revenge as much as any other goal in the game. Monsters or characters capable of doing terrible quick getaways are ideal for this. A vampire drains one of the characters dry, turns to gaseous form, and floats away laughing at them. A dragon flies overhead, sets the entire party on fire, and goes home. You know, these are the kind of people that will totally get a party motivated to do something about it. Now, when it comes time for that final climactic battle, sometimes it's going to be anticlimactic. And I think that's okay. If the reason it's anticlimactic is because the player characters have had all their ducks in a row. They've thought through, oh, we're fighting a vampire wizard. What can we do to minimize the things that a vampire wizard can do to us? What can we do to find all the possible maximum advantages? They've already encountered him in his full glory and gotten the beating they so richly deserved. So if they come back the second time and have really thought through with it, and the combat only takes a couple of rounds and they crush the vampire wizard, I'm totally okay with it. They earned that fair and square.
Makes sense, makes sense. Jared, what about you, sir, for big bads and final bosses?
Okay, I agree with Jeff, and one of my favorite dirty GM tricks is to insert a helpful, benign-looking character early on in the scene that helps the characters, only to find out that that's your big bad from the beginning when you get to the end. Because nothing makes the characters hate that big bad more than finding out, oh, we could have beaten him up when we had him. I'm more of a fan of the big finale than the big bad. I like it when it's both parties racing towards a goal. I would use Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark as a prime example. Belloc is definitely an adversary, but there is no real big bad in that. It's we're trying to achieve this one final goal of capture the Ark, and there's a lot of opponents that come up against you along that way that make it more significant. What I like to do is what Jeff was saying: create a very smart antagonist that wants the same things that the players want, the same final goal they want. Have that antagonist interact with them early throughout the campaign, and then when you get to the apex point of resolution for this story, the finale, that's when the big bad shows up, and he's trying to do the same thing the player characters are trying to do. And it becomes a thing of, well, wait, if the Nazis get the Ark, game over for humanity. It's not necessarily about, and I say this having had experience with Savage Worlds, where there is no way for you to predict what is going to happen. With exploding dice and bennies and all of the cinematic action variabilities that you have in that, there's no way to. You can often end up with a very anticlimactic big bad fight. And what I'm saying is, I don't think your big bad battle should ever be just about defeating the big bad. The big bad becomes a part of that set piece towards the conclusion of the final goal. He's another obstacle to get over.
Cool, it makes sense, Jared. Thank you. Krista, now and the question was fighting the epic end or the big bad, the big boss, how do you make sure that that's a good payoff or satisfying for the group and yourself?
Well, I think in addition to everything that the other panelists said, which I didn't hear a piece of advice I disagreed with in the group, I think don't forget to take into account each of your characters' story arcs and figure out how this final epic situation is going to resolve those or lead to the resolution of those individual character story arcs. It might not be a few characters' goal to defeat the big bad, but the defeat or the epic finale must lead to a resolution for them of some kind. And you'll want to spend maybe a session or two after the final conflict spotlighting how those stories happen. Did you notice if you watch Parks and Rec, they ended the series on this kind of strange note, and then they did this this extra episode to sort of resolve the character arcs, because I think a lot of fans were dissatisfied with that. So make sure that you take some time after the final conflict to go through that with each of the players. Those can be one-on-one sessions if that's what everybody wants, or if everybody wants to see what happens, then have everybody at the table join in.
Thanks, Krista. One thing that if you've got a non-combat, in a solo game that I ran one time, I had a pretty much a non-combat focused character, and when we got to what was obviously this big fight that had been led up to for a long time, we decided we were just going to skip past the entire fight and then handle it in the conversation with her character in the hospital, because she was a combat character. It was a fight on a rooftop, and it was pretty interesting to do it that way, in that the flashback mentality. Probably not satisfying for people who've got a really exciting idea for their combat moves, but really worked for that scene. We have come up to our time, and we've got a number of questions on Q&A, some other questions. I think we could probably talk about combat for I don't know, a giant 150-page chapter out of every RPG book that you read. Probably. But we can't, because I don't want to take up too much time for a wonderful expert panelist. Thank you so much, Jeff, Jared, Kat, and Krista, for joining us for this panel. Really excited to have your expertise. Thank you so much for coming on. And thanks, everyone, for participating. Again, if you're catching this late, it's going to be on the YouTube channel for Indie Plus. And I hope everyone has an excellent night.
Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Thanks. Sorry my camera gave out.
It's all quite all right. Have a good night.